All right, y'all, this is part 6 of my series on the false feminist historical narrative that women were oppressed all the time by men systematically. This issue is going to have to do with voting. I'm going to start with another video of Janet Fiamengo's series on debunking the false feminist historical narrative, also on her channel, Fiamengo File 2.0. So let's give it a listen, see what she has to say.
The 19th century was a period of sweeping democratic reform that saw an extensive series of parliamentary changes in Britain that progressively extended voting rights that had been originally restricted to upper-class men alone. Until the later 19th century, the vast majority of British men lacked the right to vote, and it's difficult to believe that the vote wouldn't have been given to women in time as part of the general expansion of democracy. That feminists then and now almost never acknowledge the presence of voteless men in Britain should on its own completely invalidate their myth-making. So briefly, voting rights were first extended in 1832, then again in 1867, and again in 1884. The 1832 Reform Act gave the vote to about 1 in 6 property-owning adult men. Then the 1867 Act extended the vote to working-class men in urban areas, and the 1884 Act gave the vote to rural working-class men. In all these cases, income and property qualifications limited the extensions, with the result that about 40% of British men still did not have the right to vote in the period after 1884 and through the First World War, the very time when feminist women were making their angry demands.
Okay, so let's take a look at some of these voting dates here. The years that women's suffrage was secured, the vote for women in American states, as compared to the dates there that are in the timeline that Janet showed in her video on the vote. So I'm not going to go through all of them here, just to give a few examples. Here in Arizona, they were starting to work for it in the 1880s. Up here, installed in 1905. That's too much to go through. I've got better examples. Let me see here. Oh, Utah, in the Utah Territory, they gave them women the vote right off the jump. Now it goes back and forth. It says that it was repealed, and then they had a battle, it looks like, with the federal government over Mormonism. But once again, Washington State, they attempted to grant the vote in 1854. Didn't finally get secured until 1910, but even still, take it for what it's worth. Very, very different than the narrative that we're sold. That basically it was neck and neck. This doesn't seem to be at all when you see it through a different lens. A matter of women just fighting for the vote. It was a change in society, of industrialization, where all kinds of people were trying to get into the act. One I found that was really interesting here is New Jersey. New Jersey, look at this. New Jersey, right off the jump, on Confederation of the United States following the Revolutionary War, placed only one restriction on the general suffrage: the possession of at least 50 pounds, about 10,100 adjusted for inflation in dollars, in cash or property. 1970, the law was revised to include women specifically, and in 1790, and then in 1797, the election laws referred to a voter as he or she. This is key here, what I wanted to touch on. Female voters became so objectionable to professional politicians that in 1807, the law was revised to exclude them. Okay, and then it went on to say that their Constitution in 1844 limited the guarantee right to vote only to men. But you have to ask yourself, us knowing what we know about politicians and how they love voters, and as many voters as they can get would be better, why did female voters become so objectionable to the professional politicians? Why? Is it at all possible? Is it at all possible that they started to see what Janet is also going to touch on at the end of her video here, that has been very well established now, that women have been voting for many decades? I don't know if you all have ever seen any of those maps that have been produced over the years, showing that if only had women voted or only had men voted, and they break it all down for all demographics. And they'll show you if only had blacks had voted or only gays had voted, whatever it may be. But basically it shows you that if only women had been voting for, since they were guaranteed the franchise, 1920, 1921, whatever the exact year was. We would basically be in a communist nation. That is one thing that I will completely agree with Rollo Tomassi on, that he says that when women are in power, and I don't think it's his original idea. I'm quite sure that I've read it before, that many sociologists or psychiatrists, people in those professions studying it, will show that overwhelmingly when men are in power or have the power to organize communities or societies, they do so in a communal way. Men much more so do so in a hierarchical way, where it is a meritocracy, that you get positioned based upon achievement, where women, it is very much based on egalitarianism, because they're much more empathetic. It only makes sense. They have hormones of estrogen that are there to be fair. You need to be fair-minded and nurturing and even-keeled to take care of small children and nurse them, and that you give birth to. So, they basically, to give the example, look at it kind of like, well, here a woman is that has 10 women in her organization, her business, her family, that she needs to make sure that everybody is taken care of, and so it's all based on their needs. Susie is pregnant, so she gets 2 of these. Mary isn't, so she gets 1. Barbara is pregnant and already has 2 kids, so she gets 3, etc. Where men aren't nearly as concerned for that. Obviously, by extension, because of their wives, their daughters, they have to have that on their radar, and they definitely have. But it's there between the men. It is a throwing of the elbows, a meritocracy. Whoever performs the best is the one that is going to be able to have the most say and or get the most resources. Kentucky was another notable one, going back to the vote here. Passed it up. Doesn't look like they have these in alphabetical order. Is it by year? I don't know. I'd found it before. I have it written down 1838. Now that was not federal, to my understanding. It was municipal. But even still, did anybody listening to this, did they know any of these alternative facts? Was it put in a balanced way at all? Or was it always just put in, as I'm coming to realize more and more, actually in these days, with every passing day that I do more of this research, if I were just taught a completely cartoonish, vulgar history of the country, of our society, of the relationship between men, women, between everybody. Basically, you get a page or two, maybe a very short chapter on voting rights. This is the year that men got it. This is the year the women got it. Then several paragraphs or pages about these great struggles involved, whether they apply to women, whether they apply to blacks. Nowadays, I'm sure they're applying to gays as well, immigrants, disenfranchised people. And then I've come to realize that beyond that, where do we really get our narrative? We just get it from the media. We get it from movies. We get it from TV programs. We get it from commercials. We get it from documentaries. And those are all produced mediums. They're all produced mediums that can very, very much, and as you look into it, you understand, absolutely do have agendas to form a certain psyche. It's not necessarily, and as I'm finding out more and more, and I hope you are too as you follow these videos, related to, connected at all to any facts on the ground, or very few facts. Very few facts, omissions, half-truths, and lies, which are much more effective than just blatant, out straight lies and exaggerations, which are much easier to debunk on face value. When you throw in a little bit of truth, then you obfuscate some very important facts, then you throw in a bit of a half-truth. It's a way better way to go about that if you want to trick people into thinking something that isn't. Which is, of course, the point of all my work in these videos.
The argument against extending the vote to women was most often made on the assumption that women were, in general, less suited to politics by temperament, at a time when most women were occupied in the domestic realm, often pregnant, often caring for children, and dealing with complex households. It was doubted that women had the capacity to understand or even care about politics. One anti-suffragist observed of the women in her district that, quote, many simply go on from day to day without taking any part in the wider life outside them, without being in the least interested in any public question, end quote. Such an assumption, though irritating to suffrage activists, didn't signal any lack of appreciation for what women did contribute to society as mothers, helpmeets, educators, authors, healers, caregivers, or community activists. Women had always been involved and encouraged to be so in local and municipal elections and in charity work. But in general, anti-suffragists believed that women and men were happiest and society functioned best when there was a complementary division of labor, with women focused mainly on the home front while men acted in the larger world. Historian Brian Harrison summarizes that, quote, the precariousness of life, the absence of welfare facilities, the frequency of childbearing, the complexity of housekeeping, the central importance of domestic economy in the literal sense, these were all factors which forced husbands and wives into mutual dependence, end quote. According to the anti-suffrage view, it was simply not true that women lacked political representation without the national franchise. On the contrary, women's interests were vigorously pressed by the men in their families and by male politicians generally. Liberal Party member and British ambassador to Washington, James Bryce, contended that, quote, there can be no more baseless assumption than that the polling booth is the main source of influence in politics. Women already enjoy greater influence in other ways, both public and private, than the franchise would give them, end quote. Some argued that women had more influence precisely because they weren't bound by party loyalties and their advocacy was thus seen as nonpartisan. Throughout the 19th century, the subjects on which women did agitate for reform, including women's higher education, changes to divorce law and child custody law, women's property rights, age of consent, all these saw an all-male parliament quick to act. Harrison notes, quote, it is difficult to think of reforms for which late Victorian women energetically campaigned and which they were not granted, end quote. What was sometimes called the separate spheres arrangement was promoted by anti-suffragists as most likely to uphold women's well-being. And anti-suffragists believed that politics was ultimately and should remain a male contest because the ballot was a metaphorical substitute for the ability and requirement to use physical force if necessary when politics failed. To extend the ballot to those without the obligation or ability to fight was to introduce a falseness into the political system that would ultimately weaken whatever nation implemented it. If they were wrong, it wasn't because they hated women. Many of them, on the contrary, worshipped women and wanted to protect them from the corrosive effects of public life. Well, as we know, their arguments did not win the day. Neither, though, did the angry demonstrations of the pro-suffrage forces, which were never popular with the majority of the public and may, in fact, have delayed the granting of the vote by showcasing the hysterical vehemence of many, especially the suffragettes, who smashed windows, set off bombs, and physically attacked parliamentarians and police officers. Feminist Wilma Meikle, in her 1917 book called Towards a Sane Feminism, proposed that much pre-war feminist agitation had been inspired by little more than lust for public celebrity and pointless rage. Quote, let us, while there is still time for repentance, she wrote, humbly and with tears confess that all that was done and undone by pre-war feminists was nothing but a prodigious crop of feminine wild oats, end quote. Somewhat ironically, it was the First World War that decided the matter of the suffrage. Women's service on the home front, their work in munitions factories and farms, changed public attitudes toward women, and a 1917 vote passed easily in the British Parliament to extend the franchise to servicemen who had previously been voteless and to women aged 30 and above. The war might have confirmed the anti-suffrage argument that physical force was still a factor in world affairs and that unable to fight women shouldn't be able to direct national decisions, but it didn't. Women thus won the right to vote on the backs of hundreds of thousands of men dead in the trenches of Europe. Feminist activists like Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, now considered the great heroines of the noble suffrage struggle, contributed little or nothing to the victory. And although it is now difficult to imagine a world without women voting in national elections, it is at least as difficult to outright dismiss the anti-suffragist concerns. A female electorate has made politics increasingly emotion-based, with an ever-expanding state bureaucracy catering largely to women's social concerns, fears, and easily triggered outrage. 100 years after women began voting, research has repeatedly found that men express far more knowledge about and interest in political matters. A 2019 article about the gender gap in Britain reported a 20-point gap in expressed political interest amongst 15-year-olds and a 30-point gap amongst 25-year-olds. A Pew Research poll of Americans found women consulting newspapers for stories primarily about, quote, weather, health and safety, natural disasters, and tabloid news. Men were far more interested in, quote, international affairs, Washington news, and sports. According to another report that criticized newspapers for failing to attract female readers, women prefer local stories, accessible graphics, and an engrossing narrative rather than fact-based news. The stereotypes that suffrage activists raged against have turned out to be mostly true. What is perhaps most interesting about the debates concerning women's voting rights is that they occurred at a time when it was still possible to discuss what was best for society from a perspective that included everyone, men, women, and children, not just women. One of the things that woman suffrage achieved was to make it nearly impossible in the end to talk about any good other than a feminist one.
So there you go. The next time that they try to tell you how terrible it was, don't you know? What are you talking about? Don't you know women were oppressed for all of history? What are the two big ones that they always give you right off the bat? Women could own property. I'm going to get onto that one in the next video. And that women couldn't vote. And now you can see that it was neck and neck. And remember, too, that the women never had to register for the selective service and go off to war in mass and die and be maimed for the right to vote. Men did. And as we can see there, it was neck and neck when you compare the dates of how the franchise was being expanded to everybody. This wasn't really, in my opinion, really, as Janice said in the video, had really anything to do with women fighting for their rights. It was a time of great change where they were expanding and looking at the way everything was done and giving people a lot more participation due to industrialization. And even on a final note on that, me personally, my view has changed so much on this. That being used as such a gotcha moment that women couldn't even vote. What has voting done for us anyway, in all honesty? Because personally, I've come to think that it's just a scam, especially if we haven't seen that in the last years with all of the electronic voting machines and the voting fraud and the way they can manipulate it. That's a whole subject in itself. It's a hollow victory that they all got to vote. In other words, they got to participate in the clown show, in my opinion. They got to be able to be ridiculed and clowned equally as all of the men of today. So, big deal. But I'll wrap it up there. That is our chapter on the false narrative of voting and equal rights. And I hope to see you all in the next one. In 1869,